With the reveal of Aldebrand's name, ReZero will never be the same again. In this video, I want to talk about the reveal and what it could mean for the ReZero series. If you're someone that wants to be spoiled, don't worry, I'm going to pretty much tell you the scoop so you know exactly what's happened and what led up to it. Anyways, let's begin. To make a long summary short, at the end of Arc 8, Priscilla Barrio died. As a result, Aldebrand wanted to go to the Pleiades watchtower to see the Books of the Dead. For those that don't know, because you haven't seen Arc 6, in the Pleiades watchtower, there are books known as Books of the Dead, and when you die, you get a book with your name on it. If you're someone that knows the person that has died, you can actually read their Book of the Dead and see their memories and experiences. Aldebrand wanted to go to the watchtower to find Priscilla's book. However, that wasn't actually the truth. He didn't actually want to see Priscilla's book. He wanted to get his own Book of the Dead and Natsuki Subaru's. Aldebrand possesses an authority which is essentially like return by death, but it has a shorter return by death time point. So his checkpoint is like a minute ago. After locating what Aldebrand needs, he approaches Subaru and Beatrice when they're sort of unaware, and he makes small talk with them. However, he catches them off guard and uses a forbidden magic. This magic is known as Ol Shamak. This essentially seals Subaru and Beatrice away from the world and puts them in a small black spear, which he then takes and he's going to throw them into a giant chasm, which leads to a different world based on the narration. Of course, this leads to a giant fight breaking out in the Pleiades watchtower, but like I said, Aldebrand has a authority, and he uses that to beat Garfiel and Ezo. As the fight continues, Aldebrand shows Volcanica his Book of the Dead, which essentially overwrites Volcanica's will, turning him into a dragon Aldebrand. As Al and Volcanica escape, Reinhard appears, and essentially Aldebrand cannot beat Reinhard. However, he actually set up an insurance policy. This policy was placing a Book of the Dead, namely Subaru's Book of the Dead, in their belongings, which means that when Petra and Emilia found the belongings and they wanted to figure out a counterattack, this led to Petra reading Subaru's Book of the Dead and therefore learning about Subaru's power. However, this is a big no-no because now Satella appears. This leads to Reinhard and Satella fighting, allowing Al to escape. Now Aldebrand meets with his compatriots, which is of course Heinkel, Astria, also Ye Tenzin. If you haven't read the side stories, you probably don't know who she is. And of course Roy Alphard, the Sin Archbishop of Gluttony. Al continues to have battles, beating people like Felt, Old Man Rom, giant armies of people, beating Emilia and the Emilia camp, beating Otto, and many more. Eventually, he reaches his objective. His objective is to reach something called the Great Crater, and this is apparently a hole or geyser that sort of reaches to a different world. And he wants to throw Subaru into this chasm to get rid of Subaru. Why does he want to do this? Well, we don't really know. At the end of the arc, where everyone has pretty much been defeated, Ye Tenzin, Heinkel, Roy Alphard, they've all been defeated and restrained. However, the same goes for the good guys as well. There's only Petra left standing. Now, for those that don't know, Petra actually has the witch factor of melancholy, which belonged to Clind. Now again, if you're anime only, you probably don't know who Clind is. He did appear in the anime for like one frame, but he's essentially the butler to Anna Rose, and he's part of the Roswell Manor. It turns out he actually had the witch factor of melancholy from Hector, which we saw in season 2. This witch factor is special and it was passed on to Petra. Petra officially becomes the Witch of Melancholy. However, for her to use her power, she needs to sacrifice her future. For example, Petra might say, "I swear I will never kneel down in the future," which means for the rest of her life, she's not allowed to kneel down. In exchange for doing that sacrifice, she's going to be granted power to essentially use something called compression. Compression reduces the time or distance it takes to go between objects or to do certain things. For example, if you were 100 meters away from someone, you could use compression to shorten that distance so you could teleport there instantly. Regardless, Aldebaran and Petra are the final two combatants of the fight, and in this final fight, Petra is trapped within Owl's domain. It turns out that Owl's domain has a second function, and this is known as the aggressor. And I do have a video about Owl's authority. In that video I called it subjugator, but it's essentially the same thing. This mode of Aldebaran's domain essentially stun locks Petra into a never-ending loop, and Petra literally goes mad, and she actually kills herself in one of the loops. But because everything resets over and over and over again, she essentially becomes broken as a person. However, that's where her authority actually wins her the situation, because she gives up her future potential of giving up. So she literally says, "I swear I will never give up again." And in response, she literally cannot give up, and she breaks through the domain. This results in her summoning, using compression, Felix, Argyle, and Roy Alphard. As stated before, Roy Alphard is chained up, and the reason why Roy Alphard is working with Aldebaran is because Aldebaran placed a contract on him, which meant that Roy Alphard could not refuse Aldebaran's requests, namely that he cannot eat people's names or memories. Roy Alphard, of course, is a Sin Archbishop, so he's tried to betray Aldebaran in the past and it didn't work. So the fact that Petra summoned him meant that Owl thought that Roy had tried to betray him a second time. Aldebaran assumed that Petra summoned Roy so that Roy could eat her memories, because remember, Satella, the Witch of Envy, was essentially summoned because Petra learned about Return by Death. So if Roy Alphard ate Petra's memories, she would forget, meaning that Satella would go back to sleep, meaning that Reinhard, who's currently fighting Satella, can come and beat Aldebaran. And this would actually be checkmate for Aldebaran. However, that wasn't her true intention. She actually summoned Felix Argyle, as I mentioned before, and for those that don't know, Felix Argyle is the strongest healer in the world, meaning that Aldebaran could no longer kill himself to return by death, meaning that Aldebaran pretty much lost. Elsewhere, Clind and Roswell are fighting Volcanica, and they manage to beat Volcanica because Volcanica has a different goal. He fires a shot towards the Great Crater, which is what he was tasked with doing. So even though he was defeated, he achieved his objective. When we cut back to Aldebaran, we see that Volcanica's blast landed, creating a mist shockwave, which means that Aldebaran has this time to escape. And the best way to escape is if everyone around him forgets who he is. So he tells Roy Alphard to eat his name, and his name is Natsuki Rigel, and that is the twist ending for the chapter. So there's quite a lot to talk about when it comes to the reveal of Natsuki Rigel. Now, most of you probably already know this, but Natsuki is of course Subaru's family name, Natsuki. But Rigel is also a star name, and for those that know, if you've watched or read the Sloth If material, you would know that Rigel is the name that Subaru gives to his son. And on screen you can sort of see an image of Natsuki Rigel. He essentially looks like Subaru and has blue hair. Now we do know that Natsuki Rigel, at least Aldebaran, has black hair, which means of course that Natsuki Rigel can't be his son from the Sloth If route. Like, how would that actually work? Because Sloth If is like a what if route, and Natsuki Rigel in Sloth If doesn't even exist in the main continuity because Rem and Subaru don't have a child. So the question is, who is Natsuki Rigel? So there are several different interpretations, and the most common one is that Natsuki Rigel is Subaru's brother. Of course, we know that Aldebaran calls Subaru brother pretty much for the entire series. That would be one of the biggest throwbacks and foreshadowing that Tappei has made. Of course, we assume that Aldebaran called him brother because they're both from Japan, but maybe if they're actually literally brothers. And there's actually foreshadowing in Arc 6 for this. In Arc 6, Subaru even thinks about the idea that after he was summoned, there's a possibility that his parents might have had a different child. And that child, if they were summoned, that meant that it would explain why Aldebaran is a lot older, because he was simply summoned into the past and grew up. The narration, it doesn't really imply how Aldebaran was born. Many people that you'll watch online will say that, oh no, Echidna created Al. That has never been confirmed. When it says Echidna created Al, it says it in the sense of the way he was brought up. And the analogy they use in the narration is how Yae Tenzin was created to be a shinobi, because she lived in the shinobi village, and that was their customs. Just like how the Witch of Greed, Echidna, brought up Aldebaran. What we do know is that Aldebaran was birthed, and he was given the name Natsuki Rigel. And we know that the people that give their children star names is Subaru's parents, Kenichi and Naoko, and they gave Subaru the star name Subaru, which is of course for the Pleiades cluster. If Subaru was summoned and then they had a different child, which was Rigel, they continued with the tradition, which would explain, by the way, why Subaru and Ao have so many similarities, like the Sanpaku eyes, the black hair, the fact that they have the same family name. And that will explain why they look similar but are a bit different. Tappei also confirmed that he knew that the name of Aldebaran will be Rigel 10 years ago, over a decade ago, which means that he planned everything. So when he was writing Sloth If and he named Subaru's son Rigel, he did that on purpose, because Tappei is very specific about character names. There's also something else he said which was really interesting. Tappei also pointed out something really interesting, this idea that if worlds might influence the main ReZero world. Tappei was kind of vague about it, but it's something to keep on mind, and it's on screen now for you to read. Now, what do I think will happen? I saw a post on Twitter, I forgot who it was, but it was really interesting. The name of Arc 9 is Light of a Nameless Star. We now know that Aldebaran's name is a star name, Rigel. And what about the nameless part? Well, it makes sense, because he wants Roy Alpha to eat his name. So that means that his name will be eaten, everyone will forget about him, and he will achieve his goal. However, there is going to be one person that can actually remember him, and that's of course going to be Subaru, which leads to what the author said here, where someone asked if Aldebaran would be happy, and Tappei said, well, it depends on Subaru's effort, which goes to show that Subaru will eventually be released and will have that conversation with Al. And maybe the reason why Aldebaran hates Subaru is because he was summoned and he left their parents in despair, and so Rigel grew up with the parents being depressed and always hearing about Subaru, and so he had a sense of resentment until he was summoned. Well, let me know what you guys think anyway, but this was such an amazing chapter.